Welcome to the Wanderers History Podcast and to a new episode looking at the Mediterranean policies of Spanish King Philip II and the links between events at Djerba, the Great Siege of Malta, and the War of Cyprus. In the previous episode, I talked about the early life of Philip II and a few of the books and sources that I would be looking into. We'll be looking mostly at the period between 1559 and 1581. It's an interesting period because during this time, the European political landscape had suffered numerous changes. Before we continue, I'd like to remind you to please hit that subscribe button and notification bell to make sure you never miss any new history material from the podcast. Let us resume. As I've said before, during the period of the Spanish-Ottoman conflict between 1560, that's when the Battle of Djerba happens, and 1581 of the secret truce between the Spanish and the Ottomans during Murad III, the European political landscape had suffered numerous changes. We have the Ottoman Empire beginning to show visible signs of decline during the reigns of Selim II and Murad III, who were unable to replicate the successes of Suleiman the Magnificent. Rome sought the election of 4 different popes with very different characters and policies. In France, the inefficient regency of Catherine de' Medici was plagued by internal religious unrest and a visible decline of the Valois dynasty. Finally, the Venetians, in their pursuit and desperate need of a powerful doge, such was Andrea Gritti in the 1530s, they struggled and eventually managed to survive the War of Cyprus with Alvise Mocenigo as doge. In contrast to the previously mentioned cases, Spain experienced a long period of monarchical continuity under Philip II. Philip II's policies were crucial in the development of the Ottoman-Spanish Mediterranean conflict, and it directly affected the situation of the Venetian Republic. It is also worth asking if Philip II saw the War of Cyprus as an opportunity to divert Ottoman attention away from the Italian peninsula, Sicily, Malta, and Tunis, especially after 1560 and the events that happened at Djerba, to move all of this eastwards closer to the Levant and more in Venice's sphere of influence. This would be in the detriment of the Venetian Commonwealth, which saw itself caught in the middle of a prolonged Turco-Spanish Mediterranean conflict, where once more, after 1560, had the upper hand over Spain and all other Mediterranean powers. Spanish-Venetian relations during this period were mostly riddled with distrust, a lack of coordination, and ultimately borderline enmity, much like they were during the time of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. Philip II would face many challenges after 1568, especially with the emergence of the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands, but also of the Morisco Rebellion, also known as the Rebellion of the Alpujarras, which lasted between 1568 and 1571. And towards its end, overlapped with the early stages of the new Holy League, forged by Pope Pius V. Spain and Philip II's foreign policy would rely on 3 pillars, namely Cardinal Granvelle, Louis de Requesens, and Juan de Zuniga, and we will talk more about their negotiations with the Venetians and the papacy later on in this episode. I'll also want to touch on the intricate relationships between both branches of the Habsburg family, the Austrian and the Spanish, and the Venetian Republic. There was a division formed between the Spanish and Austrian branches stemming from Charles V's splitting of his empire into 2 parts before his abdication. Interestingly, there are more similarities between Maximilian II, so Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II, desired to avoid War of the Ottomans at all costs after 1564, and the way the Venetian Republic also wanted to avoid war with the Ottomans, and they avoided it as much as possible until the emergence of the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War. In his book entitled Empire and Holy War in the Mediterranean, the Gallian maritime conflict between the Habsburgs and Ottomans, Philip Williams talked about, quote, a tension within the Habsburg system that is the rivalry between the ideals of valor and prudence, between the desire to protect Christendom against its most terrible and dreaded enemy, and the imperative to preserve the fleet at all costs, end quote. As a final point on this, it'll be interesting to mention the fact that Maximilian II ultimately did not join the Holy League, which had the papacy, Venice, and Spain in it, which, while it did not recover Cyprus for the Venetians, it delivered a blow to the Ottoman maritime colossus, their fleet, at Lepanto in 1571. Going back a bit, Spain's relations with France were pacified after 1559 in the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, and the strong naval support of Genoa was continued for Doria and the local Genoese nobility. Philip II could focus more on the Mediterranean Ottoman campaign. The following declaration of the Spanish king revealed the reasoning behind his initial plans. He said, quote, "In view of the peace concluded between me and the King of France, and in view of the advanced age of the Sultan and the anxiety that the discord between his sons had caused him, I believe that neither negotiations nor concluding a truce with him is in my interest." End of quote. Here we see Philip II making references to the situation in the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman the Magnificent was getting quite old. There was strife between his sons, namely Selim II, who would ultimately become Sultan and succeed him, and the other son, Shehzade Bayezid, who would eventually be captured after the Battle of Konya, and he would be also executed, and that would settle the line of succession for the Ottoman Empire. So ultimately, Philip II sees this as an opportunity to strike at the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, and that's where the Battle of Djerba comes into play. He's in a very solid position before this, and afterwards, the decimation of his fleet forces him to go on the defensive afterwards. At Djerba in 1560, Spain's short-lived offensive momentum in the Mediterranean was crushed, resulting in a critical deterioration of Spain's navy and a crucial loss of thousands of valuable veterans. Therefore, this defeat had long-lasting consequences on Spain's naval power, which for a decade did not engage the Ottomans. Moreover, this loss would affect all Mediterranean campaigns from the 1560s and early 1570s, including the failed Ottoman siege of Malta in 1565, the Ottoman incursion in the Italian Adriatic coast from 1566 to 1568, and ultimately with the failed 1570 Catholic expedition with the Holy League for the relief of Cyprus. All the aforementioned events involved Spain's required yet never fully committed action, which were intrinsically linked in what Fernand Braudel considered as a 22-year-old Turco-Spanish Mediterranean conflict. This starts with the Battle of Djerba in 1560, and this ends with the truce from 1581. After Djerba, Spain became even more reliant on Andrea Doria and Genoa's fleet, and this would constitute a critical impediment in the forced alliance between the Spanish and the Venetians from 1570, mainly because of the rivalry between Venice and Spain up until that point. Mediation from Pope Pius V would be required. So after the events of Djerba, Spain was forced in 1565 to react to the Ottoman siege at Malta. Yet fear of another defeat prevented a direct confrontation with Mustafa Pasha's army, as Philip II had ordered Garcia de Toledo to engage only in the most advantageous situation for the Spanish fleet, which would result in minimum losses. This was the commencement of a highly defensive and cautious strategy adopted by Spain and Philip II, which would be replicated in the 1570 failed expedition for the relief of Cyprus. Moreover, the Spanish refused to pursue and engage the retreating and panicked Ottoman troops and deliver a devastating counterattack after the relief at Malta. As Kenneth Seton argued, quote, Don Garcia's purpose was to break the Turkish siege by a show of force without risking the Spanish soldiery of whom the king had continual need. End of quote. This instinctive self-preservation benefited Spain and Philip II. Malta successfully yet barely resisted the siege, while the Spanish fleet and army remained intact. This was done, however, at the risk of the Ottomans nearly conquering a crucial strategic position. Philip II saw great opportunity deriving from the siege of Malta. He had managed to obtain renewed subsidies from Pope Pius IV for the maintenance of his fleets. This form of extortion had somewhat disappointed Pius IV, reflected in his speech at the Assembly of Cardinals that took place shortly after the relief of Malta. He did not mention, let alone thank, Philip II or Toledo. The relations between Spain and Venice can be better understood by examining the reactions during the aftermath of the failed siege of Malta. The Venetians, wishing to preserve their neutrality and avoid war with the Ottomans, did not participate. Unsurprisingly, the Grand Master omitted mentioning any contribution of Toledo in the relief of the siege, which attracted further antipathy from the Sicilian viceroy. Consequently, a minor but relevant rift began to form in 1565 between Spain and Sicily on the one side and the Knights of St. John with Pius IV on the other. The prudent approach taken by the Spanish Philip II led to the Venetians questioning the reliability of Spanish forces in future campaigns and maybe another Ottoman war. Another clear indicator of Spain's reluctance and prudence was the missed opportunity for a Spanish counterattack after the Ottoman retreat at Malta. And this was observed by the French ambassador, who wrote to the French king that the Sultan had been concerned due to a possible attack on the Ottoman domains in the Aegean. With the Spanish on the defensive, the Venetians were also trying to fortify their domains without attracting the attention of the Porte. This was problematic due to the proximity of Cyprus to Ottoman Syria and Anatolia. The year following the Great Siege of Malta, so 1566, began shrouded in uncertainty. Pope Pius IV, whose policies greatly benefited the Roman Church and most of the Italian republics, had died in December 1565. Spain became increasingly preoccupied with its deteriorating rule over the Netherlands. The election of Cardinal Ghislieri as Pius V in early January 1566 brought immediate stability and appeared to have strengthened the unity of Western Christendom. The French king had provided the Knights of St. John with a substantial sum to rebuild. Philip II supplied goods and munitions worth more than 50,000 écus and provided the assurance of a prepared army of 6,000 infantry in the event of another Ottoman siege. Philip II would be concerned about a potential Ottoman attack on the Sicilian kingdom, which was under his control. Sicily was of great importance for both the Italian peninsula and Spain because of its resources and agricultural productivity. However, it was ill-prepared and equipped for a large-scale siege, and in order to support a garrison of over 3,000, over 12 galleys, and to defend the Spanish outpost at Goleta, it created a large deficit of over 300,000 ducats. Sicily represents an example of how much Spain exhausted and exploited its southern Italian fiefs. Spain controlled the trade of its vast supply of grain to the detriment of Sicilian merchants. According to contemporary accounts, quote, the Sicilians were all so disaffected and desperate, nobles as well as commoners, that if they were not held in check by force, every place being full of Spaniards, and if they had a powerful prince to whom they might turn for support, one would certainly see some important changes. End of quote. This is from the book, the fourth volume of Kenneth Seton's The Papacy and the Levant, volume number 4. The geopolitical Mediterranean landscape would significantly change with the election of Pope Pius V, who was more of a crusading pontiff whose main goal was to unify Western Christendom, including Spain and Venice, and create a united front against the Ottomans. Pius V displayed more of a cooperative attitude towards Spain, realizing that a naval defeat for the Ottomans could not be obtained without Spanish support. Pius V was a much better tactician, as he immediately urged Philip II to temporarily stop aggressions towards the Ottoman Empire to prevent a closer alliance between France and the Porte. Pius also intended to improve the relations between Spain and Venice, two of the strongest Mediterranean powers, which he aimed to conciliate in order to form a strong coalition against the Ottomans. This appeasing strategy seemed to have had an immediate effect, as the Spanish king Philip II was willing to offer Venice 4 Italian cities in order to attract the Venetians into an alliance against the Turks in 1566. This did not happen in that year, and it was a test to see if the Signori would be willing to break their neutrality and take arms against the Ottomans. However, in 1568, a lot of Spain's resources had to be directed towards extinguishing the Morisco rebellion, which the French ambassador in Madrid, Forquevaux, described as a process which, quote, consumes and burns Spain with a slow flame. Philip II realized that he could not fight on all of these fronts, so he had to prioritize the extinguishing of the growing revolt in the Netherlands to the detriment of any offensive Mediterranean campaign. Philip II provides a very good description of the period between 1565 and the one between 1568 as one of constant alert in the Mediterranean, defined by permanent espionage between Spain and the Ottomans, saying, quote, "They were determined not to go to war, but correspondingly interested in the spreading of as many false reports as possible and successfully alarming each other. One side believing that the enemy fleet was preparing to attack now La Goleta, now Malta, now Ragusa and Apulia, Cyprus and Corfu, the other fearing a raid on Tripoli, Tunis, or Algiers. The fears were short-lived. The intelligence services of both sides were sufficiently organized for this shadow boxing or war of nerves not to deceive anyone for long, but it obliged both adversaries to take precautions which weighed heavily on the Mediterranean as a whole." End of quote. Another mistake made by Philip II of Spain was his reluctance to personally go to the Netherlands as advised by Pope Pius V and try to negotiate a peaceful resolution with the insurgent Protestants in the Netherlands. His refusal to negotiate with the Dutch emerging Protestant faction led by William the Silent showed a rigidity that proved very costly for Spain, and therefore it indirectly affected the future Holy League and the coalition's campaign against the Ottomans. The same happened with Don John of Austria, who was forced under direct orders from Philip II to solve the situation of the Morisco rebellion in Granada. Venice, and to a lesser extent the papacy, would endure great difficulties in the following half a decade due to Spain's imprudence. And I'm referring here the nature of the difficulties about the Mediterranean struggles that both the Venetians and the papacy faced against the Ottomans. All in all, between 1560 and 1575, Philip II had to deal with a crushing loss at Djerba in 1560, a great Ottoman threat at the Great Siege of Malta in 1565, a state of unrest with the Moriscos in Granada, an eruption of conflict in the Netherlands against emerging Protestant forces, all while Spain's finances were under severe strain and at constant risk of bankruptcy. add the not so great relations with Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, and the Empire, and a reluctance to join a crusading effort launched by the papacy in order to save Cyprus for the Venetians, and we see a very entangled and complicated history of arguably one of the most important rulers in 16th century Spanish and Mediterranean history. His infamous prudence shaped the war in the Mediterranean, which would start to gradually dissipate after what happened at Lepanto and the conclusion of the Ottoman-Venetian War after 1573-74. Ultimately, a truce was signed in 1581 between the Spanish and the Ottomans. Spain was able to focus its attention on the War of Portuguese Succession and to integrate Portugal and its dominions into its kingdom, empire. The Ottomans and Murad III would shift their attention to Rumelia, the Levant, and conflict with the Safavid Empire. For more history on the Great Siege of Malta or the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War, make sure to check the first series of the podcast, the Venice and the Malta ones. I believe they're the first 8 or 9 episodes. I will want to revisit the history of Philip II, look more in depth at the Morisco Rebellion, his management of Spanish finances and the empire all in all, his complex relationship, Philip II's, with the papacy. I'd like to explore all of this in future episodes of the podcast once the current series focused more on the general history of the 16th Mediterranean from a more, I could say, a Brodelian perspective is finished. I am thinking writing a whole mini-series looking at the entirety of Philip II's rule and hopefully discuss if there was, as Geoffrey Parker coined the term, a grand strategy of Philip II's. Thank you for listening to this episode about Philip II of Spain and his Mediterranean policies between 1560 and 1581. Make sure to subscribe to the channel to never miss any new material from the podcast, and until the next time, all the best.